The morning of December 20th, 1943, dawned cold and grey over the airfield at Kimbleton in Cambridgeshire, England. A thick blanket of fog clung to the ground, slowly dissipating as the weak winter sun struggled to break through the overcast sky. On the hard stands scattered across the base, ground crews worked with practiced efficiency, preparing their charges for another mission into the heart of Nazi-occupied Europe. Among those aircraft sat a Boeing B-17 Farads Flying Fortress, serial number 42-30137, bearing the name Ruthie II, painted in white script across her olive drab nose. She belonged to the 379th Bombardment Group, 524th Bombardment Squadron, and this morning she would carry her crew on what should have been a routine mission to Bremen, Germany. The B-17 Farads Flying Fortress was a marvel of American engineering and industrial might. Weighing in at 65,000 pounds fully loaded, the aircraft stretched 74 feet 9 inches from nose to tail, with a wingspan of 103 feet 9 inches. 4 Wright R-182097 Cyclone radial engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower, gave the bomber a maximum speed of 299 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Her service ceiling reached 37,500 feet, and she could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs deep into enemy territory. But what made the B-17 truly legendary was her defensive armament. 13 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns positioned throughout the aircraft, from the chin turret to the tail gun, capable of putting up a withering curtain of fire against attacking enemy fighters. First Lieutenant William Lawley Jr., a 23-year-old pilot from Alabama, performed his pre-flight walk-around inspection as dawn broke across the English countryside. Lawley stood just under 6 feet tall, with dark hair and the lean build of someone who had grown up working hard. He had joined the Army Air Corps in 1942, burning with the desire to serve his country after Pearl Harbor. After completing his training, he had been assigned to the 8th Air Force and shipped to England in October 1943. This would be his 5th combat mission, and though he was still relatively inexperienced, his crew had begun to develop the kind of trust that kept men alive in the brutal skies over Europe. The crew of Ruthie II numbered 10 men, each with a critical role to play. Second Lieutenant Paul Murphy served as co-pilot, a steady hand who had already logged 8 missions. Technical Sergeant Henry Mason manned the top turret and served as flight engineer, his knowledge of the B-17 systems second to none. Staff Sergeant Thomas DeLuca occupied the ball turret beneath the fuselage, perhaps the most vulnerable and claustrophobic position on the bomber. Staff Sergeant Robert Schaefer and Sergeant Michael Williams served as waist gunners, standing at the open windows in the middle of the fuselage, where the freezing wind roared through at 200 miles per hour. Sergeant James Cooper handled the tail guns, isolated in his cramped compartment at the rear of the aircraft. Staff Sergeant Frank Peshout worked as radio operator, and Sergeant Edward Slish served as nose gunner in the plexiglass compartment at the front of the aircraft. Rounding out the crew was Second Lieutenant Harry Mason, the bombardier, who would guide the aircraft to the target and release the bombs. The briefing that morning revealed a straightforward mission profile. The 379th would join the larger formation of the 8th Air Force in attacking industrial targets in Bremen, a major port city and manufacturing center in northwestern Germany. Intelligence indicated heavy flak concentrations around the city, and the Luftwaffe fighter forces in the region remained formidable despite mounting losses. The bomber crews could expect determined opposition, but the mission planners believed the potential damage to German war production justified the risk. The weather forecast called for improving conditions over the target, with scattered clouds at 15,000 feet and good visibility. Formation assembly would begin at 0700 hours over the English coast before the armada turned east toward the enemy. As Ruthie II's engines coughed to life, filling the air with the throaty roar of 4 radial engines, Lawley ran through his checklist with practiced efficiency. The cockpit of a B-17 was a cramped space filled with instruments, gauges, switches, and controls. The yoke jutted up from the floor between the pilot seats, connected to cables that ran through the fuselage to the control surfaces on the wings and tail. Throttle quadrants, propeller pitch controls, and mixture levers occupied the center console. Above, the overhead panel contained switches for fuel management, electrical systems, and engine controls. Every surface displayed some critical piece of information: airspeed indicator, altimeter, artificial horizon, turn and bank indicator, rate of climb, manifold pressure gauges, tachometers, fuel quantity gauges, oil pressure and temperature readings. A pilot needed to constantly scan these instruments, building a mental picture of the aircraft's status while simultaneously maintaining formation position and watching for enemy fighters. The takeoff roll in a fully loaded B-17 was always an exercise in faith and physics. The bomber needed nearly the entire runway to build up enough speed to lift her massive weight into the air. Lawley advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling the aircraft begin to roll forward, slowly at first, then gathering momentum. The tail came up as airspeed increased, the runway markers flashing past faster and faster. At 90 miles per hour, Lawley eased back on the yoke, and Ruthie II reluctantly released her grip on the earth, climbing slowly into the grey English morning. The gear came up with a hydraulic whine, and Lawley trimmed the aircraft for the long climb to formation altitude. The assembly over England was a carefully choreographed aerial ballet involving hundreds of bombers. Each group launched coloured flares to identify itself, circling at assigned altitudes until all aircraft had joined up in their proper positions. The 379th would fly in the lead position of the high squadron, considered a position of honour, but also one of significant danger. Lead aircraft drew the most attention from enemy fighters, and their position at the front of the formation meant they would be first to encounter the flak belts defending the target. Lawley slipped Ruthie II into position off the wing of the lead aircraft, making constant small corrections to maintain proper spacing. Flying formation in a B-17 required intense concentration. Too close, and the risk of collision increased dramatically. Too far, and the defensive firepower that made the formation effective began to break down. The massive formation of bombers turned east over the English coast, crossing the North Sea toward the enemy shore. Below, the grey waters stretched to the horizon, broken only by whitecaps whipped up by the winter wind. The bombers climbed steadily toward their bombing altitude of 22,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold. Despite electrically heated suits, the crew endured temperatures that dropped to 30 or 40 degrees below zero. Frost formed on the inside of the fuselage, and the gunner's breath crystallized in the air. At these altitudes, a man could not survive without oxygen, and each crew member remained connected to the aircraft's oxygen system through a rubber hose and mask. Equipment failures at this altitude meant death within minutes, as hypoxia clouded the mind and shut down the body. The German coast appeared ahead, a dark line separating sea from sky. This was the moment when the tension ratcheted up several notches. From this point forward, the crews would be fighting for their lives. The Luftwaffe had developed sophisticated early warning radar systems that tracked the Allied bomber formations from the moment they left English shores. Fighter controllers on the ground vectored their interceptors toward the bombers, calculating intercept points with mathematical precision. German fighters would attack from every angle, trying to break up the formations and pick off stragglers. Single aircraft separated from the formation were easy prey, their defensive guns unable to cover all approach angles simultaneously. The B-17's defensive armament was impressive on paper, but in practice, the arrangement had gaps. The chin turret, introduced on the G model but retrofitted to some F models like Ruthie II, covered frontal attacks. The top turret, manned by the flight engineer, rotated 360 degrees and could engage fighters attacking from above and either side. The ball turret underneath protected the vulnerable belly. The two waist gunners covered the beam positions, while the tail gunner protected the rear. The nose gunner and bombardier had flexible 50s to engage fighters making head-on passes. Yet despite all these guns, blind spots existed, and experienced German pilots knew exactly where they were. The favourite tactic was the head-on attack, diving from 12 o'clock high, guns blazing, then breaking away below the bomber formation before the American gunners could track them effectively. As the formation crossed the enemy coast near Wilhelmshaven, black puffs of flak began to appear in the sky. German 88mm anti-aircraft guns fired shells set to explode at specific altitudes, throwing shrapnel in all directions. The flak gunners on the ground used optical rangefinders and radar to calculate the bomber's altitude, speed, and direction, then fired patterns of shells designed to fill the sky with deadly metal fragments. A direct hit from an 88 could blow a bomber apart in an instant. Even near misses could cause catastrophic damage, shredding control surfaces, puncturing fuel tanks, or killing crew members. The official instructions told pilots to maintain course and speed through flak fields to ensure accurate bombing. But this meant flying straight and level while enemy gunners tried to kill you. The mental discipline required to hold formation, while black flowers of death bloomed all around, tested even the most experienced crews. The bombers pushed deeper into Germany, following their planned route toward Bremen. Navigation at 22,000 feet with clouds below required careful attention to airspeed, heading, and elapsed time. The navigator worked at his small table behind the cockpit, using dead reckoning and radio fixes to track the formation's progress. Radio silence was mandatory to prevent German fighters from homing in on transmissions, so the navigators had to be correct. A wrong turn could take the formation over a heavily defended city or into areas with concentrated fighter bases. The bomber stream stretched for miles, a massive aerial armada carrying thousands of tons of high explosives toward the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The Luftwaffe fighters made their first appearance 30 minutes from the target. Black dots appeared in the distance, growing rapidly larger as they closed at a combined speed of over 400 miles per hour. The intercom crackled with warnings from the gunners as they identified the attackers. Fokker-Wulf, 190 seconds, and Messerschmitt, 109 seconds, the Luftwaffe's premier fighter aircraft, came boring in from multiple angles. The FW-190 was a compact, powerful fighter powered by a BMW radial engine producing over 1,700 horsepower. Armed with two 13mm machine guns and four 20mm cannons, it could shred a bomber with a single well-placed burst. The Me-109 was lighter and more nimble, with excellent high-altitude performance and deadly armament. Both aircraft were flown by experienced pilots who had learned hard lessons about attacking B-17 formations. The first attacks came from head-on, the fighters streaking through the formation in the blink of an eye. The closure rate was tremendous, giving gunners only seconds to track and fire before the fighters flashed past. Tracers laced through the air as the bombers' guns opened up, the 50-caliber Brownings hammering out 850 rounds per minute. The smell of cordite filled the fuselage as spent brass casings clattered to the floor. Return fire from the fighters sparkled along their wings as they fired their cannons, the large projectiles capable of devastating damage. In the tail position of Ruthie II, Sergeant Cooper tracked a 190, making a high stern attack, walking his tracers toward the fighter until it broke away trailing smoke. Whether he had scored a kill or simply damaged the aircraft, there was no time to determine. More fighters were already lining up for their attacks. The air battle developed into a swirling, three-dimensional melee that stretched across miles of sky. Some bombers fell out of formation, trailing fire, or with engines feathered, beginning the long descent toward the earth far below. Parachutes blossomed like white flowers against the blue sky as crews abandoned their stricken aircraft. Other bombers absorbed punishment and kept flying, testimony to the rugged construction that had earned the B-17 its Flying Fortress nickname. Holes appeared in wings and fuselages, hydraulic fluid leaked, and wounded crew members received first aid from their companions while the battle raged. The intercom carried a constant stream of calls: fighter positions, damage reports, warnings of flak ahead. In the cockpit, Lawley fought to maintain formation position while simultaneously tracking the tactical situation. His hands and feet made constant small corrections to the controls, working against the slipstream that tried to push the bomber out of position. The flak intensified as the formation approached Bremen. The Germans had ringed the city with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns, creating a killing zone that every bomber had to pass through to reach the target. The black bursts appeared directly ahead, and there was no way around them. Lawley could feel the aircraft shudder as shrapnel rattled against the fuselage. A chunk of metal punched through the plexiglass nose, missing the bombardier by inches. Another fragment severed a hydraulic line, sending red fluid spraying across the bomb bay. The barrage seemed to last forever, though in reality it was only a few minutes. Time compressed and expanded strangely in combat, seconds stretching into hours, while entire sequences of events flashed past in the blink of an eye. The bombardier called out their approach to the initial point, the location where the final bomb run would begin. From here, the bombers would fly straight and level for several minutes, while the bombardier lined up his Norden bomb sight on the target. The Norden was a sophisticated analog computer that calculated the precise moment to release the bombs based on airspeed, altitude, wind direction, and the trajectory required to hit the target. During the bomb run, the bombardier effectively flew the aircraft through small corrections transmitted to the autopilot. The pilot's job was to hold the aircraft steady while flak burst all around, and fighters made determined attacks on the vulnerable formation. It was during this critical phase, with Ruthie II boring straight toward the target through heavy flak, that catastrophe struck. A German fighter, identified later as a Focke-Wulf 190, came diving out of the sun from 11 o'clock high. The pilot was experienced and brave, holding his course despite the stream of tracers reaching up toward him from the bomber formation. He opened fire at close range, his cannons stitching a line of destruction across Ruthie II's left wing. 20mm shells exploded on impact, shredding metal and severing structural members. The wing's main spar, the critical load-bearing beam that held the wing together, took multiple hits. Simultaneously, the fighter's guns raked the cockpit and nose section. The impact was devastating. Co-pilot Paul Murphy died instantly, his body torn by cannon fire. In the nose, the bombardier and nose gunner both went down, severely wounded. The plexiglass nose shattered, and hurricane-force winds roared through the front of the aircraft. But the damage to the wing was the most critical problem. Roughly 3 feet of the left wingtip simply disintegrated, torn away by the combination of cannon shells and aerodynamic forces. The aileron on that side was gone, and fuel poured from ruptured tanks in a fine mist that could ignite at any moment. Worse, the internal structure of the wing had been severely compromised. The remaining sections were held together more by skin and luck than by any structural integrity. The B-17 immediately snapped into a violent roll to the left. The asymmetrical wing configuration created uneven lift, with the damaged left side producing significantly less than the intact right wing. This imbalance generated a powerful rolling moment that threatened to flip the bomber inverted. Lawley instinctively hauled back on the yoke and applied full right aileron, fighting to keep the wings level. The control forces were enormous, the damaged control cables and surfaces responding sluggishly to his inputs. His co-pilot was beyond help, slumped in his seat, and Lawley was alone in the cockpit of a crippled bomber at 22,000 feet over Germany. The aircraft wanted to roll left and enter a spin, an attitude from which recovery would be impossible. Lawley's arms trembled with effort as he held the yoke hard over to the right, his legs braced against the rudder pedals to coordinate the turn. The airspeed was bleeding off as the damaged wing created enormous drag. The engineer, Mason, appeared at Lawley's shoulder, taking in the situation at a glance. Without being told, he grabbed the co-pilot's yoke and added his strength to Lawley's, both men fighting the aircraft's tendency to roll. The intercom was mostly dead, damaged in the attack, but Mason didn't need it to understand what was needed. Ruthie II had fallen out of formation, unable to maintain altitude or keep up with the other bombers. This made her extremely vulnerable to follow-up fighter attacks. A single bomber was an inviting target, and several German fighters peeled off to finish the job. The gunners who remained operational called out warnings, but with limited ability to maneuver, Lawley could do little to evade. He focused entirely on keeping the aircraft in controlled flight, making minor adjustments to compensate for the aerodynamic forces trying to tear the bomber apart. The right wing dipped despite Lawley's efforts, and the bomber entered a spiraling descent. The altimeter unwound rapidly as they dropped through 20,000 feet, then 19,000, 18,000. The ground, invisible beneath the clouds, was waiting far below. Lawley knew that if he lost control, if the aircraft entered a true spin or the wing failed completely, none of them would survive. The men trapped in various positions throughout the fuselage had no parachutes readily accessible. The ball turret gunner, De Luca, was stuck in his position, unable to exit quickly even if he had been able to retrieve his parachute from inside the fuselage. The wounded men in the nose had no chance of bailing out. Their lives depended entirely on Lawley's ability to fly a fundamentally unairworthy aircraft. Fighting with every ounce of strength and skill he possessed, Lawley managed to arrest the descent at around 14,000 feet. He found a combination of control inputs and power settings that produced something approaching stable flight. The aircraft was still descending, but slowly now, the rate manageable rather than catastrophic. The trim tabs, small adjustable surfaces that helped relieve control pressure, were mostly ineffective due to battle damage, so Lawley had to maintain constant pressure on the yoke. His arms burned with fatigue, but he didn't dare relax his grip. Mason continued to help, though his position meant he couldn't maintain the awkward stance for long periods. The two men traded off periodically, one resting briefly while the other held the aircraft in the sky through sheer force of will. The German fighters made several more attacks, but the return fire from Ruthie II's remaining gunners was accurate enough to discourage extended engagement. The fighters had other targets, and ammunition was limited. They broke off after scoring some additional hits that killed the radio operator and wounded one of the waist gunners. The tail gunner, Cooper, continued to fire whenever a target presented itself, his ammunition supply dwindling but his determination unshaken. With the immediate fighter threat reduced, Lawley took stock of his situation. The aircraft was barely controllable, descending slowly through 13,000 feet, heading roughly west, but with limited ability to navigate precisely. The intercom was largely inoperative, making coordination with the crew difficult. Several crew members were confirmed dead, others wounded. The hydraulic system was damaged, meaning the landing gear might not extend and the brakes would likely be inoperative. Fuel was leaking from the damaged left wing, though the rate seemed to have decreased as the tanks emptied and pressure dropped. The No. 2 engine, inboard on the left wing, was running rough, hit by shrapnel during the attack. One of the right engines showed fluctuating oil pressure, suggesting it might fail at any moment. The logical course of action was to order the crew to bail out. Standard procedure, when an aircraft was this severely damaged and over enemy territory, was to abandon it and take your chances as a prisoner of war. But Lawley looked back into the fuselage and saw his wounded crew members, saw the dead co-pilot beside him, saw the flight engineer helping him keep the aircraft in the air. He thought about De Luca stuck in the ball turret, about the wounded men who couldn't bail out, about the men who had fought beside him. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would try to fly the crippled bomber back to England. The English Channel lay nearly 300 miles to the west. Between Ruthie II and safety lay the full breadth of occupied Holland and Belgium, territory bristling with anti-aircraft guns and fighter bases. The aircraft was losing altitude steadily, and Lawley calculated that they would be down to less than 5,000 feet by the time they reached the coast, if they made it that far. The fuel situation was critical but uncertain. The gauges for the left-wing tanks were reading 0, but the engines continued to run, drawing from the right wing or from fuel trapped in various sections of the damaged left wing. Navigation would be challenging without functioning instruments and with limited visibility from the cockpit. But Lawley had made his choice. They were going home. He called to Mason and explained his plan. The engineer nodded, understanding, then made his way back through the fuselage to inform the crew. Those who could bail out should prepare to do so if the situation worsened, but for now, they would stay with the aircraft. The waist gunners moved the wounded to more comfortable positions and administered morphine from the first aid kits. They covered the dead with whatever material they could find. The temperature inside the aircraft was well below freezing, with the nose section blown out and numerous holes throughout the fuselage, so they wrapped the wounded in any available fabric to prevent hypothermia from claiming those who had survived the German guns. The damaged B-17 limped westward, descending through the winter sky like a wounded bird. Lawley flew by instinct and feel, making constant adjustments to keep the wings roughly level. The aircraft wanted to roll left, wanted to drop its nose and spiral into the ground, but Lawley refused to let it. His world narrowed to the instruments before him, the feel of the controls in his hands, the sound of the engines labouring to keep the broken bomber aloft. Time became meaningless. Minutes felt like hours. His arms screamed in protest at the constant strain, but he ignored the pain. Mason periodically took over, giving Lawley brief moments of rest, but the pilot never fully relinquished control. This was his aircraft, his crew, his responsibility. They crossed the border into occupied Holland at approximately 8,000 feet. The aircraft's shadow, visible occasionally through breaks in the clouds below, raced across the patchwork fields and small towns of the Dutch countryside. Some German units fired small arms at the passing bomber, but at their altitude and speed, these posed little threat. The real danger was another fighter attack or mechanical failure. The No. 2 engine continued to run rough, coughing and missing, and Lawley considered feathering it to prevent fire. But the bomber needed every bit of power available to maintain altitude, so he kept it running, watching the gauges carefully for any sign that shutdown was necessary. The fuel gauges crept downward with agonizing slowness. Lawley had reduced power to the most efficient cruise settings, but even so, the 4 radial engines consumed fuel at a prodigious rate. He calculated and recalculated their position, trying to determine if they had enough fuel to reach England, or if they would have to ditch in the North Sea. Ditching a B-17 inches winter water was almost certainly fatal. The crew would have perhaps 10 minutes in the frigid water before hypothermia rendered them unconscious. Rescue was possible if rescue aircraft could locate them quickly, but the odds were not good. The Dutch coast appeared ahead, a flat expanse where land met sea. They crossed the shoreline at approximately 6,000 feet, the altimeter still unwinding slowly. The North Sea stretched before them, grey and cold, whitecaps visible on the surface. Lawley turned slightly north, aiming for the shortest crossing point. The crew maintained vigilant watch for German fighters operating from Dutch bases, but none appeared. Perhaps the Luftwaffe had written them off as doomed, or perhaps they were engaged elsewhere. Whatever the reason, Ruthie II crossed into international waters, unmolested. The flight across the North Sea was perhaps the longest period of Lawley's life. The aircraft continued to descend, passing through 5,000 feet, then 4,000. The English coast was still nearly 100 miles away. The engines ran smoothly enough, but the fuel gauges showed desperately low levels. Mason brought Lawley coffee from the thermos, heavily sweetened for energy, and the pilot drank it gratefully. His hands were cramping from maintaining constant pressure on the yoke, his shoulders and back knotted with tension. The engineer spelled him occasionally, but increasingly Lawley found that he didn't trust anyone else to maintain the delicate balance required to keep the aircraft flying. He had developed an instinctive sense for what the crippled bomber needed, adjusting power and trim by feel as much as by reference to instruments. At 3,000 feet, Lawley began to make out the English coastline through the haze. The sight sent a surge of hope through his exhausted body. They were going to make it to England. Whether they could land successfully was another question, but at least they would reach friendly territory. He aimed for the most prominent landmark he could see, adjusting course to compensate for wind drift. The bomber mushed through the air, barely maintaining altitude. Every foot gained through careful power management immediately lost to the drag of the damaged wing. They crossed the English coast at less than 2,000 feet, low enough that Lawley could make out individual buildings and vehicles on the ground. He needed to find an airfield quickly. The fuel gauges showed empty, running on vapour and fumes. The No. 2 engine had developed an alarming vibration, and oil streaked back from the cowling. The aircraft wouldn't stay in the air much longer. Mason retrieved a flare gun and fired red flares, the emergency signal that would alert any airfield in the area that they needed immediate landing priority. A small airfield appeared ahead, likely a fighter base rather than a bomber station, but Lawley didn't care. They were coming down one way or another, and he preferred a runway to a field. He began a gentle descent, careful not to let the airspeed bleed off too low, or the damaged wing might stall and drop. The landing gear was the next challenge. With hydraulics damaged, he needed to use the emergency backup system, a hand pump that required many strokes to build enough pressure to lower the wheels. Mason worked the pump furiously while Lawley flew, and eventually 3 green lights illuminated, indicating the gear was down and locked. Whether the indicators were reliable after all the damage was uncertain, but it was the best they could achieve. The approach to the runway was unlike any landing Lawley had ever attempted. The aircraft resisted level flight, requiring constant control inputs. The asymmetrical wing created a tendency to bank left, which he corrected with right aileron and rudder. The damaged control surfaces responded unpredictably. Lawley flew the approach partly by instruments and partly by looking out the side window, since the nose section was largely destroyed. The airspeed indicator might or might not be accurate with the pitot tube possibly damaged. He flew by feel, judging speed by engine sound and the response of the controls. The runway rose to meet them. Lawley held the aircraft off as long as possible, bleeding off speed, the stall warning buffeting through the airframe. The main wheels touched first, a firm contact that jarred through the fuselage. He held the yoke back, keeping the nose high, letting the damaged aircraft settle. When the nose wheel touched, he cut the throttles and pressed the brake pedals. The brakes were indeed inoperative, as expected. Ruthie II rolled down the runway, still travelling at over 60 miles per hour with no way to stop. Lawley saw the end of the runway approaching and steered toward the grass overrun, hoping the soft ground would slow them before they encountered any obstacles. The bomber left the paved runway and bounced across the grass. Each impact transmitted through the airframe with jarring force. The left main gear, weakened by battle damage, collapsed, and the left wing dropped to the ground. The aircraft slewed sideways, digging a furrow in the soft earth. Metal shrieked as stressed structures finally gave way. The bomber ground to a halt in a cloud of dirt and grass, tilted heavily to the left, engines still windmilling as they spun down. For a moment, there was silence, except for the ticking of hot metal cooling and the whistle of wind through thousands of holes in the fuselage. Lawley sat in his seat, hands still gripping the yoke, unable to believe they were on the ground and alive. Mason clapped him on the shoulder, and then the emergency crews were arriving, fire trucks and ambulances converging on the wrecked bomber. The crew who could walk began evacuating through the waste door, helping the wounded. Medical personnel climbed aboard to assist with the casualties. Ground crew members stood staring at the damage, shaking their heads in disbelief that the aircraft had flown at all, let alone made it back from Germany. The left wing was a study in destruction. Nearly 3 feet of wingtip was simply gone, the remaining structure showing massive damage to spars, ribs, and skin. Control cables hung loose where they had been severed. The aileron was destroyed. Fuel tanks had been punctured in multiple places. The engineers who examined the wreckage later stated that the wing was held together primarily by the skin and should have failed catastrophically at any moment. That it had supported the aircraft's weight for over 3 hours of flight was remarkable. The fuselage showed hundreds of holes from cannon shells and shrapnel. The nose section was shattered, plexiglass gone, bombardier's position destroyed. The cockpit area showed the impact points that had killed the co-pilot. Multiple systems were damaged or destroyed: hydraulics, electrical, oxygen, intercom. 3 engines were still running when they landed, but barely. The number 2 engine seized 30 seconds after shutdown, its internal components destroyed by battle damage. Several fuel tanks were dry, others showed only residual fuel. By every calculation, they should have run out of gas over the North Sea. The human cost was severe. Co-pilot Paul Murphy had died instantly. Bombardier Harry Mason died of his wounds shortly after landing, despite the best efforts of medical personnel. Radio operator Frank Peschaut was also killed during the fighter attacks. Several other crew members were wounded, some seriously, but all the survivors ultimately recovered. Out of 10 crew members, 3 had been killed and 5 wounded. Only 2 emerged physically unscathed. The official investigation into the incident attempted to determine how Lawley had achieved what should have been impossible. Experienced test pilots examined the wreckage and attempted to replicate the control inputs required to maintain flight with such asymmetrical damage. In controlled conditions, with full knowledge of the aircraft's state and no enemy action, they found it extraordinarily difficult. To have done it in combat, with limited instrumentation, over enemy territory, while helping to physically control the aircraft because the co-pilot was dead, stretched the boundaries of credibility. Yet the evidence was irrefutable. The bomber was there, the surviving crew members told consistent stories, and the damage spoke for itself. Lawley's actions that day were recognized with the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration for valor. The citation read in part, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty. Coming off the target, he was attacked by approximately 20 enemy fighters, shot out of formation, and his plane severely crippled. 8 crew members were wounded. The co-pilot was killed by a 20mm shell. One engine was on fire, the controls shot away, and Lieutenant Lawley seriously and painfully wounded about the face. Retaining his position, Pilot Lawley gave the order to bail out, and 7 of the crew left the ship. Lieutenant Lawley remained with the wounded and maneuvered the crippled bomber into a crash landing. His heroism and exceptional flying skill were directly responsible for the saving of several lives. The actual details were somewhat different from the official account, but the essence was correct. Lawley had indeed saved his crew through extraordinary skill and determination. The question of whether they should have bailed out, whether attempting to fly the crippled bomber was reckless or heroic, was debated in various forums. The answer depended partly on perspective. For the wounded crew members who survived because Lawley got them home, there was no question. For the families of those killed, the calculation might have been different. For Lawley himself, it had never been a calculation. He had simply refused to abandon his men. The psychological impact of the mission stayed with Lawley for the rest of his life. He completed his tour of duty, flying additional missions, but he never forgot December 20th. The image of his dead co-pilot beside him, the desperate fight to keep the aircraft flying, the weight of responsibility for his crew's lives, all became part of who he was. After the war, he rarely spoke of the incident, deflecting questions and downplaying his actions. Those who knew him well said he carried a sense of sadness for the men who had died, a feeling that perhaps he should have done something differently, although no one could identify what that might have been. The mission to Bremen illustrated several critical aspects of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. The B-17, despite its nickname and reputation, was not invincible. German fighters and flak destroyed or damaged thousands of them over the course of the war. The concept of the self-defending bomber formation, while sound in theory, required constant refinement as German tactics evolved. The presence of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang introduced later in the war, significantly reduced bomber losses by engaging German fighters before they could attack the formations. The human dimension of the air war often got lost in discussions of strategy and statistics. Behind every mission number, every loss report, every bombing assessment, were real people in life-or-death situations. Young men in their early 20s, barely out of high school or college, found themselves flying complex aircraft into heavily defended airspace, facing death or capture on every mission. The psychological strain was enormous. Bomber crews faced some of the highest casualty rates of any service branch. The statistical probability of completing a 25-mission tour was disturbingly low in 1943. Many crews were shot down on their first or second missions. Those who survived became fatalistic, superstitious, or sometimes reckless with their off-duty time, knowing each mission might be their last. Lawley's story became one of many remarkable accounts from the air war. Other pilots performed similar feats of airmanship in desperate circumstances. Some flew bombers with multiple engines out, or with major structural damage, or with control surfaces shot away. They nursed crippled aircraft across hostile territory, kept broken bombers in the air long enough for crews to bail out, or attempted crash landings in fields and forests when reaching an airfield proved impossible. The community of bomber pilots developed enormous respect for those who brought their crews home against impossible odds. The technical lessons from Ruthie II's survival informed later aircraft design and damage assessment procedures. Engineers studied how the B-17 structure had failed, and more importantly, why it hadn't failed completely. The redundancy built into critical systems, the robust construction methods, and the overall design philosophy of the aircraft all contributed to its ability to sustain damage and continue flying. These lessons influenced post-war aircraft development, particularly in military aviation, where survivability remains a critical design parameter. The story also highlighted the importance of pilot training and skill. Lawley's ability to control the damaged aircraft came from hours of training in basic flying skills, instrument procedures, and emergency techniques. Modern pilots might have more sophisticated equipment, but the fundamental skills of aircraft control, situational awareness, and decision-making under pressure remain unchanged. The best technology cannot compensate for inadequate pilot skill, as Lawley's performance demonstrated. His extensive training, combined with natural ability and determination, made the difference between survival and disaster. For the families of the crew members who died, the mission was a tragedy, regardless of Lawley's heroism. Paul Murphy's family lost a son and brother. Harry Mason's bombardier skills would never again guide bombs to their targets. Frank Petchote's radio would stay silent forever. These men had volunteered to serve their country, accepted the risks, and paid the ultimate price. Whether their deaths could have been prevented through different decisions or tactics was unknowable. They had died doing their duty, in service to a cause larger than themselves, and their sacrifice deserved honor and remembrance. The strategic impact of individual missions like the Bremen raid was difficult to assess. Some bombs hit their targets and disrupted German war production. Others fell in open fields or residential areas. The cumulative effect of thousands of such missions eventually degraded Germany's ability to wage war, but the cost in Allied lives and resources was staggering. Modern historical analysis debates whether the strategic bombing campaign was worth the price, whether different tactics might have achieved similar results with fewer losses, whether the moral implications of bombing cities were adequately considered. These are complex questions without easy answers, colored by hindsight and changed attitudes toward warfare. What remains undebatable is the courage and sacrifice of men like Lawley and his crew. They faced situations that tested the limits of human endurance and capability. They performed their duties despite fear, despite losses, despite the knowledge that death was a constant companion. Lawley's decision to attempt the flight home, his physical strength in controlling the damaged aircraft, his refusal to give up when abandoning the aircraft would have been justified, all speak to qualities of character that transcend any particular war or historical period. These are timeless virtues: courage, duty, loyalty to comrades, perseverance in the face of overwhelming obstacles. The story of how a bomber pilot flew a B-17 with half a wing and no functional crew back to England is ultimately a story about human potential under extreme stress. It demonstrates that sometimes, through a combination of skill, determination, and perhaps luck, individuals can achieve what seems impossible. Lawley didn't think about making history that December day. He thought about his wounded crew members, about the responsibility he bore as pilot and commander, about the simple imperative to get his men home. His focus remained narrow and immediate: keep the wings level, maintain airspeed, watch the gauges, correct for drift, ignore the pain and exhaustion, just keep flying. In that narrow focus, sustained over hours of desperate flight, he achieved something extraordinary. The battered remains of Ruthie II were eventually scrapped, her useful parts salvaged for other aircraft, her damaged sections cut up and discarded. But the story of her final flight lived on, passed down through generations of pilots as an example of what dedication and skill could accomplish. In training classrooms and ready rooms, in books and documentaries, in quiet conversations between pilots, the tale was told and retold. Details might change slightly in the retelling, but the core remained constant: a young pilot, a crippled aircraft, impossible odds, and the determination to bring his crew home no matter what. For First Lieutenant William Lawley, Jr., December 20th, 1943 was the defining day of his life, though he lived for many decades afterward. He carried the memories of that mission, both the triumph of survival and the sorrow of loss, for the rest of his days. The Medal of Honor he received was recognition of extraordinary valor, but it could never fully capture what he experienced or the price paid by those who didn't survive. He remained humble about his actions, deflecting praise and emphasizing that he had simply done what any pilot would do for his crew. Those who knew him understood that this humility was genuine, not false modesty. He truly believed his actions had been nothing special, just a pilot doing his job. The bomber war over Europe eventually ended with Germany's defeat in May 1945. The strategic bombing campaign, of which Lawley's mission was one small part, had achieved its objectives of destroying German industry and degrading the Nazi war machine. The cost had been terrible: tens of thousands of Allied airmen killed or captured, thousands of aircraft destroyed, and enormous resources expended. But the veterans who survived carried forward the lessons learned and the memories of those who hadn't made it home. They built careers, raised families, and gradually transformed from warriors to civilians, though the experiences of war stayed with them always. In the decades since, aviation technology has advanced tremendously. Modern bombers can fly faster, higher, and farther than the B-17. They carry precision-guided weapons that can strike targets with accuracy. The bombardiers of 1943 could never have imagined. Electronic countermeasures protect against anti-aircraft systems far more sophisticated than World War II flak guns. Yet despite all these advances, the fundamental challenges of flying damaged aircraft, of making life or death decisions under pressure, of bringing crews home safely, remain essentially unchanged. The technology may evolve, but the human factors in aviation endure. The story of Ruthie II and her pilot serves as a reminder that behind the statistics and strategic analyses of war are individual human dramas of courage, sacrifice, and survival. Every aircraft that failed to return represented 10 young men whose futures were cut short. Every damaged bomber that limped home carried wounded men whose lives were forever changed. The aggregate numbers told one story, but each individual incident held its own unique narrative of human experience under the most extreme conditions imaginable. William Lawley's story is just one among thousands, but it deserves to be remembered and told, not just as a tale of extraordinary flying skill, but as a testament to the human spirit's capacity for courage and determination when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges. The young pilot from Alabama who refused to abandon his crew, who flew a crippled aircraft through sheer force of will, who brought his men home despite wounds and exhaustion and impossible odds, embodied the best qualities of his generation and his profession. His achievement that December day in 1943 stands as a permanent reminder that sometimes, against all logic and probability, human courage and skill can overcome even the most desperate circumstances.